I'm happy to start. Thank you so much. I have a fan next to me, so please let me know if the fan is being obstructive and you can hear it. It's so good to see everyone here today. Thank you so much for coming to this BEI Talks session. I'm Uracha Chatrakul na Ayudhya, and it is an absolute pleasure. I'm really excited to be here to help get this conversation going with Dr. Balissa Greene. Before we get started with the conversation, I'd like to take this opportunity to also introduce Dr. Pam Yao, who is the Assistant Dean in the School of Business Economics and Informatics. Her role is the Assistant Dean for External Engagement. She is also Reader in Management in the School of BEI, and she is also the Director of the newly launched Center for Professional Development at the school. Pam, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Uracha. That was a great introduction. So, hello, everyone, and thank you for coming along to our summer BEI Talks session. As part of our activities within the center, we host and lead a series of important conversations about timely matters. Many of these discussions are centered on current societal challenges, and we seek to ensure that there's an exchange of knowledge and insight between BEI, our colleagues, and also our wider society. So thank you very much for being part of this session and this start of this conversation. So today's talk will be on a topic that is very close to my heart in my lived experience as a woman of color. And I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to hear these two amazing women take the lead in opening up this very important dialogue. And I invite you as our participants and obviously interested parties to share your experiences, ask thoughtful questions, and actively listen to what our speakers and others have to say. Our Center for Professional Development is also delivers engaged teaching and skills development through BEI Shares and Creates. And our first workshop will be in September on scenario planning. So if you're interested, please sign up. Isabel, if you can stick a link to our center website in the chat, that'd be great. But that's me wasting 2 minutes. So I'll hand it over to Uracha and Balissa. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you so much for that introduction. And before we get started with the conversation, I want to say also on behalf of everyone here today, a big thank you to Isabel for all the hard work you've put into organizing this event. Thank you so much for making it happen for us. Really grateful. And Pam and Isabel will be monitoring the chat. So what we hope to do is to have a conversation for around half an hour to allow 20 minutes of proper conversation with everybody here. So it's not just going to be us talking at you. We really hope that you can join in and be a part of this conversation too. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Balissa Greene, who is a very dear friend of mine, and it's wonderful to welcome you to the School of BEI and to the Center for Professional Development. Welcome, Balissa.
Thank you very much for having me. Very honored to sort of be here today. I think you guys are doing such a fantastic job, and I really just am hoping to really sort of open up a dialogue and to start a conversation. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you. Now, this is the bit where I guess nobody really likes when the spotlight is on them. I'm going to basically read out all your credentials. So here we go. Dr. Balissa Greene is the Assistant Head for Diversity and Inclusion at the British Army. She is you are registered and chartered occupational psychologist, and you also are an award-winning occupational psychologist. You were awarded the British Psychological Society Practitioner of the Year Award in 2016 for your PhD, which you conducted at the LSE on the experiences of foreign and Commonwealth officers in the British Army, which we hope that you will tell us a little bit more about that in this conversation today as well. So, Is that everything?
Well, if that's on your list, then it has to be true. So, you know.
So, so we'll get started with this conversation. Balissa and I have conversations a lot, all the time. So how we want to approach this is really one of our usual conversations that we have as two women of color who occupy this space in leadership positions. We're also, you know, psychologists. Balissa and I met when we did our master's many years ago in organizational psychology in Manchester. So this is, it's been an absolute privilege and an honor for me to know Balissa and to be her friend. So we'll get started with this this conversation on equality, and it would be fantastic if you could tell us a little bit about your equality journey. Perhaps start with, how did you get started?
How did I get started? I think that's a really good question. I think maybe reflecting on it, I think I'd have to go back to childhood. And being a psychologist, I know I'm not going to sort of do this sort of an analysis route, but I think equality was really important to my family and my parents. I have to credit them with shaping that within me. I was born in London. When I was very young, my father decided, or he always had a view that we would have a better experience elsewhere, because London at that time there was a lot going on, and that's what he felt. So a sort of great sort of personal sacrifice to my mother, who is not from Trinidad. She agreed with my dad, and we migrated to Trinidad and Tobago, and I spent most of my formative years in my education I had in Trinidad. So being in that environment where it is very multi-ethnic, it's very diverse, and there weren't the sort of barriers that I sort of, you know, kind of come up against or see here today. But I would say, in terms of getting started on that journey, what my parents did was that they were very critical in spotlighting inequality when it happened. Okay, so even at school, you know, when there were instances that maybe my parents felt, you know, needed to sort of be discussed. I mean, I remember my father sitting and talking to me about what good looked like and why a particular scenario of a teacher maybe telling me that when I had came second place in a class of 30, and the teacher had written sort of good report, you know, that was all that was written. And then when I came, I think the next term, you know, because you get in a high, I'm like, oh, I'm second in class, it's really good. And I think I came 23rd, like the following term. And the teacher wrote a really glowing report, you know. So my dad sat me down and he took the report book out and he said, okay, look at this and look at this. Okay, this is what I want to tell you. Okay. And I think we talked about politics, we talked about whatever was happening. So they didn't sort of treat us as though we didn't need to know about what was going on in the world. They kind of shaped us and taught us about that. And I think now I do that with my own son, because I think unless you understand what you're seeing, and unless you understand what equality looks like and inequality looks like, and you start to have these conversations and you start to check in with people who are younger, then how are they going to understand? How are they going to get the language to call things out when they see it? And so I would say that sort of started my journey. And so, and I saw the example, you know, I saw the example of my parents sort of working and giving service, you know, to make sure that others in the community had an equality of opportunity. I saw that. So there was that example that was set, that meant, well, that's just kind of what you do. You know, if you see something that needs calling out, you call it out. That's gotten me into my fair share of trouble. But I think it's part of the journey. But I think on a serious note, I think I do believe in giving children the language and the tools to explore those conversations and to point out not just inequality, but to point out good examples of where things are right. So growing up in Trinidad and growing up as a woman, a young woman in the Caribbean is, kind of gives you a certain sort of identity, a certain sort of resilience as well. And sort of moving back to the UK in my sort of early adulthood, it was very interesting then to have doors closed that I thought should have been opened. Access to university. So I think, why wouldn't you accept me in your university? I have what it takes. Please review your decision. I appeal, right? And I accept that that's a privilege that I hold because I was taught how to do that, and not everybody is. So using that language and sort of that everyday sort of activism is, it's central to my journey. And it's the journey that still sort of carries on today. So I think that would be kind of where it started.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We also talked about how your experience of mobility and migration has shaped, your experience of professional life as well as personal life here in the UK. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about, the intersection of being a woman and a woman of color. And, we identify as immigrants. We talked about this, you and I. So how does this shape your approach to the work that you do, the activism?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think that it's almost like I have this superpower to be able to see the world in three different sort of approaches, and I think it's like you have these intersecting identities. So I think the predominant identity for me as a Black woman is that intersection of being a woman and being Black. I think being someone who has spent a lot of time in a different country, I can identify with people who have made that journey and made that transition and what they have had to, the bridge they have had to cross. And I think at different times and in different contexts, those identities will become predominant depending on the context and the environment that you're in. And I kind of wanted to kind of just go back to that issue of intersection and the fact that its origins in Black feminism, where Black feminists had to make a space where there was none, and sort of highlight that we don't have the opportunity to see the world in just one dimension. We have these intersecting identities, and both are valid. And I said at different circumstances, at different times, they will sort of be predominant. And I think that stays with me throughout the work that I do. And I bring that. I don't think it's anything to sort of put to the side. I think you have to bring your whole self to your work. And that's how I approach the work that I do today. So the research that I did, looking at Commonwealth personnel, so it's not just officers, so soldiers and officers, looking at their lived experience. What is it like for you to come from a different country into the United Kingdom to work in roles that potentially other people don't want to do? What is that experience like for you? And as an organization, how are we using that information to make that better? And whilst I kind of did win awards for that, and it was a very useful piece of work, I think it's no different to the type of work that needed to be done when, like my mother's generation came to this country to do nursing, to nurse others when no one else wanted particularly to sort of be in those roles. And we still do that today. We're still very reliant on international labor to fill skills gaps. That's not unique to the United Kingdom. But I don't know who's on the call today, but I would sort of encourage people who are in recruiting positions and positions of authority who have to make those decisions to really reflect on what is that experience like, and how is the system that we're setting up in our organization, how is that allowing those people to have an equal opportunity to succeed and to thrive. So I think in answer to your question, as you know, that's a very long way of coming to the point. You have to bring your identities with you in your work. You can't lay them down at the door. And I think now is a really good time to do that. I think now more than ever, we have the opportunity to say to our employers that it's okay, this is who I am and I'm bringing my whole self to work. And this is how I can leverage that. This is why it's a benefit, So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So in terms of your equality journey, would you say that the experiences of your upbringing and the insights that your parents in your family, and also being in Trinidad, having the benefit of thriving in a multicultural, multi-ethnic society, and then moving back to the UK in your early adulthood, do you think that has really impacted the journey that you have taken on in terms of equality and an advocate for social justice, not just in your professional life, but in everything that you do? And we have talked before about, for you, the language of service is very important to you. It's part of your identity. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, and how do you actually bring your whole self into work? Because we know that that work is risky. It's risky, and there are inequalities in terms of the extent to which different groups of people are allowed to bring their whole selves to work. So again, it touches upon privilege on the basis of gender, racialization, migration status, and a number of factors that can be used to dominate people rather than to see it as a benefit to the organization.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a really great question. And I think you've got so many great questions. That I think you do have to, I think what I'll say is, I will say in my experience, I don't have the privilege of not bringing my whole self to work, because I understand that my experiences as a Black woman can move forward and progress the diversity agenda. Okay, so I look at that in terms of what is my organization trying to do, and how can I support them in that journey? Now, I think you need to read the room. Okay, I say that to people all the time. You need to understand the lay of the land in your organization. You have to, to think about what your position is, and you also have to think about your well-being, and you have to also think about what kind of advocacy and activism you're going to do. Okay, because activism is not just about, being out in the streets and protesting, even though that's extremely important, and it's about, kind of calling things out and writing letters and all of that good stuff. But it's when you look around in your organization, and maybe this is for the people who do have the privilege of not thinking about I think if you're thinking about bringing your whole self to work, what's that about? I think if you're thinking about that now on this call, I think then you're in a great position to maybe reflect that not everyone can do that. Not everyone could do that. And so therefore my question would be, or my challenge would be, like, how do you support those who don't feel that they can do that? You know, what are the organizational structures that prevent you from doing that? I think this is what I would think about. You know, is it because, you know, if I work in a predominantly male organization, which I personally do, you know, the question is, you know, what are some of the structures that are preventing progression, that are preventing barriers, or what are some of the issues that need to be identified here? And don't get me wrong, we cannot all run all the races. We cannot tackle, you know, an individual person cannot do that, because I think even in that model that an individual is going to make a difference, I think it's useful, okay? But I think we do need to reflect on the more structural issues that are there. Why is it that in certain industries there are more men? It maybe it's because, you know, it's the progression pipeline and all that good stuff. So in terms of activism and advocacy, what can I do to sort of help and put that agenda forward? Can I go out and sort of, you know, be a volunteer, you know, to speak to, you know, young women? Can I mentor someone? Or actually, when we think about sponsorship is the thing that will move somebody from point A to B in an organization in a rapid speed. So if you're an organization thinking and wanting to make progress and wanting to make change, I would encourage you to look around at who is in positions of power, who is in the room, who's sitting around the table, you know? And the question is, how do we get more people around the table? And what can I do in my role to bring more people into the room or get them closer to the door? You know, am I taking an active part in sort of, you know, in making introductions, expanding my network, right? I think there's so much to do. And I think there's one thing I want everyone to sort of think about on this call, is that there is something that you can do to progress the agenda. And often it involves maybe being a little bit uncomfortable, right? So I've lost track of the question, but I hope that did answer it.
Absolutely. It's yeah, it was about, you know, how has your journey from your formative years informed what you do now, where you are now, and what you're aiming to do. And you've brought in very beautifully, you know, the need for collective work, collective responsibility. And you tied that in very beautifully with the idea of, you know, you can't run every race, because we talked about the risk of constantly bringing your whole self in, and to actually recognize when you ask someone to do that, that there are inequalities already in place that will stop certain people from bringing their whole selves in, primarily because of fear of lack of career progression, or wanting to assimilate and wanting to fit in for survival, which is completely understandable. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember you talk a lot about self-care, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. What does self-care mean to you, and the origins of self-care as a concept?
Okay, so I would say that, as you say, there is constant work to be done, and it is a collective responsibility, and we cannot ask those who are the ones who are at the receiving end of some of that inequality to be the ones to fix it. I would say that. I think there is a role to be played by those who are in positions of authority and positions of responsibility. But I think when we try to think about self-care, I think for me, I mean, and as we sort of have this conversation about, you know, there is always work to be done. There is always work to be done, and we're always doing the work. And at what cost? At what cost to self? At what cost to family? And which is why there needs to be this kind of collective approach. And I think self-care, I think I just sort of referred to sort of Audre Lorde, who talked about self-care being a radical act, you know, for women of color, for Black women. And it is this because we have to sometimes put down the baton to be able to rest so that we can pick it up again. Okay, and I think that's true for everyone in terms of, you know, wanting to rest. But I think for, you know, in our conversation that we're having about being a woman of color, working in this space, I think there was always activism, and there's always something to do. Therefore, I find for me, self-care looks like being in community with other women who share that experience for me, because I can go to that forum without judgment, and I can go to that forum without having to explain, and I can be vulnerable in that space. It's not often that we can be vulnerable, and I think self-care looks like finding the courage to do that. And if I can sort of touch here, I think this is not to say that we cannot be in community with anyone else. My sort of friendship circle, you know, it looks like, you know, the United Nations. I mean, I have everybody possible in my sort of friendship circle. But thinking about the importance of allyship and support, because I have wonderful friends as allies, and I'll just sort of give you two quick examples. You know, so I've got a friend, I don't know if she's on the call or not, I won't sort of highlight and sort of call her out, but just in terms of you know, when I see injustice and inequality, so for example, when, you know, there was, you know, a police force, you know, very heavily used force against someone when a child was present, and I needed to get the data. So I knew that if I wrote on my own, probably the data wouldn't come. So I asked my friend, who is white and who is a psychologist, to write the letter as well as me. So it took 7 months for the data to come, but I did not receive the data, my friend did. We both wrote at the same time. This happens in 2020 in the United Kingdom, right? You know, another friend, I was looking for housing. I know that she's in the course, so I won't sort of put her on the spotlight as well. But, you know, going into an estate agent, and she's like, well, let's go in here. And, you know, because I was looking to get a house, and she says, oh, let's go in here. And I said, well, no, I've been there. I went there this morning and they said they didn't have anything. She's like, no, let's just go. So I said, well, no, you could go. So she walks in and comes out with 3 houses to see. This happens in the UK. Okay. So the importance of, and I think that's very, building a community of people who can support you, and understanding that if you're looking around in your circle, what is your platform? Because your platform is not always your job. It's not always something that has to be, you know, you don't have a sort of big platform. Your dinner table is your platform. Your church is your platform. Your school is your platform. So how are you using these platforms to widen your circle? Because you can be a change agent literally in getting people housing, in literally accessing information. So I kind of, if there's one thing, I don't want people to feel that there's nothing that they can do, and this is sort of an overwhelming ask. I think that equality, and for me, equality means equality of opportunity to progress, equality of opportunity to kind of be successful. I think we need to think about how we can widen our circles a little bit, and how we can be allies for each other. I know we talk about sort of solidarity. I would just sort of just take that to a professional space and really sort of say that, I mean, for my organization, so I work for the British Army, and I think, you know, the leadership of the organization has been very clear about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So from that, just sort of thinking about self-care and just sort of turning it into the professional now. How do you care for yourself and show up as work as yourself? What is your organizational policy? What is your organization's policy? But rather than, in addition to policies, I would say, what is the organizational culture like? What is the organizational climate like? Are there systems in place to monitor that? Are there systems in place to collect information? Are we understanding the lived experience of those that work for us? And even if we are, because a lot of us are good at collecting data, but do we actually analyze it and use it? to make decisions and to inform decision making. So if I can just give an example of what we do in our organization, I think, that the Chief of the General Staff has been very clear about what he expects his leaders to do. And it's not just about just making a statement, it's about supplying the resources to be able to do that. So as the assistant head of the diversity and inclusion team, I'm responsible for a portfolio of work that is moving the diversity agenda forward. Okay, because there has been a recognition that, okay, we need to put some resource behind it and we need to do better. Okay, so we are measuring our organizational culture through something called climate assessments. We are understanding, what it is people are experiencing. We're putting those resources in place to be able to support leaders if they don't know what they have to do next. So it's not just about sort of saying that this is important and performative sort of statements. You do have to resource it, So I've talked for a long time.
That is a great place for me to come in, because I think you've highlighted that when we talk about trying to tackle these issues to address, intersectional justice in the workplace, we need resources, and it's structural. And this is a good place for me to come in and ask you about, going back also to kind of your earlier kind of professional experience. You were drawn into psychology at a very young age, is my understanding, and you started out with the intention of wanting to be practicing in clinical psychology. And you are now, a chartered occupational psychologist. It would be great to hear a little bit about that transition you're thinking of, the individualization approach to more systems structural approach.
Okay. No, that's a good point for reflection. And I think, yes, I'm dating myself, but I did want to be like Dr. Fraser Crane with my, with my apartment with the class and my radio show and all of this kind of stuff. But I think what drew me to organizational psychology was not really being mindful, but just wanting to act on what I was seeing. Because I started down that route and I worked for a National Health Service trust as mental health assistant and then subsequent nurse. And I remember when I was doing my nursing training, because of course I wanted to kind of get the experience, I wanted to get the experience quickly, just get the experience. It was really shocking and striking to me to see how staff were being treated, to see how staff who were largely migrants to the UK, again, thinking about the work, who wants to care for the mentally unwell? Who wants to do that work? Who wants to work in acute psychiatric units? Who wants to do that? That's just a question, right? And there's no judgment. But the people who were working there, it was very fascinating to me to kind of see how they were treated, to see the impact and literally the direct impact on somebody's skill, ability, lived experience, and the outcome for patients. Because people would circle back in the organization because they hadn't necessarily been, they hadn't had the right care, for example. And I remember talking to somebody about that and training and just people being able to communicate and leadership communicating with, people who were kind of at the shop, at the coalface sort of working. And I remember talking to somebody about that and they said, well, that's occupational psychology. And I was like, what? I want to do that, So that was like an immediate, that's what I have to do, because helping people on an individual basis is not going to move the agenda for me. It's not going to do it, right? So I think whilst there's always room for individual work, and that's a very different path, and that's needed. I think if we want to move at pace, I think addressing some of these structural issues and organizational issues is really where we are going to reap some results. And I think that has shaped the work that I do and the type of career that I've had. So I started off, when we finished sort of doing our sort of masters, I went off to do a selection and assessment with a uniformed service, and I did that for a long time. And for me, really, it was all about everything we did. I had the lens of fairness, equality, transparency. If we're running assessment centers and you're bringing people into your organization, are they fair? Are they transparent? Do people know what this is all about? Who's auditing? Who's successful, who's not? So you have to be curious. And I think I was always curious about outcomes for individuals based on how they experience an organization. So I think that's always the lens that I had. And I think I would encourage all of us to really be curious about what's going on in your organization. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I'm mindful of the time, and I really want to invite everyone who's taken an hour out of their day to be here today to have a conversation with us. So I think I'll ask one final question, if that's okay, and then we will invite questions, comments from everyone who's here today. We talked about your journey. We've reflected on, how you got started and where you are today as the assistant head for diversity and inclusion for the British Army, and how you have entered and remained in the occupational organizational psychology space as a practitioner and as a researcher and as a leader. Now, this talk was advertised as looking at how we can work together to achieve intersectional equality. And I think the emphasis is on that piece of how do we do this collectively rather than trying to, as you have touched upon this in terms of we can't run every race ourselves, and we talked about collective responsibility. But I wonder if you could say, and maybe we can have a discussion about this and we can spill this over into the Q&A session, the concept and the term intersectionality in itself has sort of been co-opted, not sort of, it has been co-opted and neutralized from its radical origins of Black feminism to the point where it's now in danger of becoming another word for diversity or difference, but multiple difference and multiple forms of diversity. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that, and if anybody has comments, do raise your hand and come in and join this conversation. But maybe if you can kickstart this reflection on where is intersectionality going, and actually is intersectional equality what we're really talking about, and can you have intersectional equality without talking about racialization?
I think that's a really good point that you make, and I think so. There's 2 points. There's 2 parts to your question. The first is about what does intersectionality mean, and I think what I would stress, I think, is that over the last, and really we're seeing it being used more and more and more now, as you say, it's been sort of co-opted in the D&I discussion to mean kind of varying paths. But I think, as we've said before, and being very clear, when we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about, for me, when I talk about intersectionality, it's about the intersection of being Black and female, right? About being a woman of color, and which is where the term started. It's because when we're looking at gender equality, sometimes we can forget that there are intersections of gender. Right. I think it's a whole different discussion today, but I think we have to be mindful. I don't think everybody does know where it's come from, because I think for some people they hadn't heard the term intersectional, before 12 months ago, right? Where there is more discussion
and there is more volume. So I think sometimes people haven't necessarily been able to kind of cut through the noise and find the original source, but that is where intersectionality has come from. So when we talk about intersectional equality, I think for me, as I've discussed before, I mean, there is a need to really think about who is around the table. So if we're talking about who, if in an organization, you're looking at bringing more women into the organization, because that's a big issue for lots of organizations. We need more females, okay? And we need more females at, this level. What do you mean? Who females are you talking about? Which females are you talking about? Are we discussing points of race there? Are we talking about religion? You know what I mean? Because sometimes in this country, in this context, when we talk about women, I think what we're talking about is white women, okay? Because when you look at some of the initiatives that are being run with, is there representation there? So the question really, and I suppose the challenge is really, if we're talking about equality for everyone, I think we always have to think about the various lenses on which we see those things. So I think there is a need for collective work. And sometimes that means if around the table there are, that somebody needs to maybe make a bit of space, pull up another chair at the table. Or how can we get someone at the door so when someone leaves, there's someone to kind of sit at the table. So it's really just encouraging those decision makers who are maybe on this call today, who have the responsibility for recruitment and progression, as I've talked to some of your students, is to think about how can we advance the agenda and what can you do? Good question. Good question.
Thank you so much. I think we will close the conversation just between the two of us here and invite everyone else to come in on this conversation. But first, can I just invite everyone to unmute and clap for Balissa, if possible. Thank you so much. Thank you for your claps. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Balissa, for just, sharing and being so open with all of us. I'm really excited now to hear if anybody wants to come in. Please do use the raise hand function. We will invite you to come in. If you'd rather not speak on the mic, please feel free to put a question in the chat. So yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Uracha. Thank you, Balissa. There was a question in the chat. I don't know if the person would like to voice it or I can voice on your behalf.
I'm happy to voice it.
Okay, right, brilliant, thank you.
It's a bit of a practical one. So I'm heading D&I for a small company, about 50 to 70 people. And I'm curious to hear how you would suggest I go about addressing issues around race inclusion as a white female. We've had, from coming into this role just about 2 months ago, we've had conversations with some of our minoritized staff members, and they felt quite a lot of pressure on them having to get involved on everything to do with D&I next to their day job, which doesn't have much to do with that. And, I want to release them from that pressure, but equally, of course, want to advance and obviously increase our staff numbers as well, but especially around inclusion. It'd be great to hear your kind of practical thoughts on that if possible.
Hi, Esther. Great question and congratulations on the role. I'm sure it will be very full for you at this time. What I would say is I think, you've touched on something in that you have the information, you've spoken to your staff, so you have the data. And I think you are in a powerful position in your role as head of D&I to raise that. And maybe there might be a reflection. I would encourage you to reflect on, what do you think are some of the barriers? And I think sometimes it's about pushback and what you're going to sort of get back from the upper echelons of the organization. But I think this is the time for us to be brave, and this is the time to advocate, and this is the time to support and to sort of share the lived experience of those staff members. Because if you are a high performing organization, if you want to take your organization to the next level, it can't be that sort of voices aren't heard. And I think it's a great thing that you've done to sort of get that information, because some organizations won't even get that data. So I would encourage you to distill that information down into some themes and some points. And I think you need to talk to your senior leadership about those issues, the issues that are being raised, and also what some of the solutions could potentially look like. So I think that would be your first step, Esther.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the talk as well. Really great.
Great, thank you, Esther. I think lots of people probably were thinking similar questions to yourself. Jessica, a student of ours, would like to ask the next question. I'll invite Jessica. Yeah,
Hello. Thank you so much for everything that you've said, and it made me think. So I heard a webinar from Joe Candola, and the Candola group very, very much in that kind of unconscious bias space, and she was talking about the importance of intergroup contact in terms of reducing people's reliance on stereotypes, and so they start to build sort of knowledge of different groups by interaction with the individual, and so that sort of takes away some of the reliance on classical and historical stereotypes, and as a way of sort of breaking down the barriers. And you were talking today about your friendship circle and being like the United Nations, and I thought that really kind of, it demonstrated that in action, and how that in itself is breaking down barriers. And I'm just thinking about contexts where there are cultures where there is one main group, a male-dominated organisation, as just one example. But in those contexts where there is one primary group, what more can we do to sort of build that intergroup contact with individuals?
That's a really good question, Jessica. And I think I'd just kind of come back to the intergroup contact, because I think this is sort of classic psychology in terms of the kind of contact hypothesis, which states that, you know, the more contact you have with somebody else, you rely less on stereotypes and, you know, that kind of thing. However, further research has showed that it's not just contact, it's contact with people who are similar to you, who share your identity. That starts to change, how we see people. So I think really when we are sort of talking about, you know, being in an organization with one particular identity, it's about, if you don't have contact necessarily, it's about sharing your stories so that people are able to then relate, because there are points of connection that connect us rather than sort of separate us. And I think, you know, for me, being in a male-dominated environment for most of my career, I think I've had to be very proactive, right, in terms of being open to different people's experiences. And I think if we're open with the understanding that we're here to learn, I think that can really help with the contact, sort of getting contact, because it might be that you share your story or someone shares their story and then somebody goes, yeah, I know such and such who's doing that. And so we start to build connections all the time. So yeah, that would be my approach.
Great.
I think dare I say as well, I think you mentioned that, you know, bring the whole self or your whole identity to the workplace. It's a benefit. And I wanted to, at that point out that a lot of models around, you know, being the diversity ought to be seen in a benefit model as opposed to a deficit model. So, you know, being a minority, you know, a lot of people say, well, you might be viewed as, oh, you're not the same or whatever, but there's so many other things you bring. So like, you know, you speak multiple languages, you know, you eat different types of food, you have different ways of thinking, and I think that organizations would do well to sort of embrace that sort of diverse model as opposed to you're not the same as us, you know, I don't know you kind of thing.
I think that's important, and I think this seeing diversity as a strength, seeing difference as a strength, but being very clear about what your organizational vision is. I think the issue is sometimes as some organizations aren't clear in what the expectation is. Therefore, if you don't see anyone bringing their whole selves to work, then you're not going to do it. I think for me, I always have a responsibility to do that, because I know that people are looking, and I don't mean sort of lurking. There are younger people who are seeing a woman like me in the position that I am in, and I have a responsibility to show up as who I am, to say that that's okay. You can do it as well, So
yeah.
Can I just interject here? I think the being open and having shared kind of commonalities, I think, is very important. And I think what the point I want to add here is there historically we have to take into account as well, like why it might not be as easy for certain groups to make contact. I'm not a social psychologist. I don't know the terminology as well as both of you do, but I think sometimes this is missing the piece on the historical context, why there is mistrust, why there is lack of trust historically based on racialization, and what can we do to foster that trust, especially when we recognize that the mainstream system operates within a white supremacy context where whiteness is the norm. And so I think that, sorry, I'm going to bring it in because I think it's important that we do acknowledge this. And I think this goes back to Esther's question, the positionality that Esther was asking about as a white woman who is heading this work. How can I do this work in a just way without, asking my colleagues who are people of color to have that burden to help advance this agenda, even though they are not experts in D&I themselves. So I feel like actually it's about building trust. And part of that is to make sure you do not fall into the danger of reproducing, tropes, stereotypes. And really importantly, you do not fall into the danger of micro-invalidating people's experiences, to actually listen properly and not to say, but have you thought about it in this way? Just listen.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's the point of having not just an organizational vision, but kind of the resources behind it. Because I will sort of come back to sort of my experience as in the Army where I am now. We have we have employee networks, employee support networks. And as you say, I think historically it's been people are doing their day jobs. And then on top of that, what we're asking them to do is educate us about your experience. Okay, you help us, you tell us what you need. And actually, I think the organization has recognized, well, we can't ask people to do that. If we really want to optimize these networks, we need to create a post that does that. Okay, and our organization is very big, granted. Okay, but we have 3 posts that will now do that. So when people want to have conferences to get together, we're not asking them to do that labor on top of their day job. Okay, we're not asking them to sort of bring in speakers on top of their day job. We're not asking them to sort of help us create policy on top of what they're doing. We need to be able to create a space in organizations where people can go, as I talked about, is that self-care and that commonality. And sometimes if you're working in an environment where there isn't any sort of contact, going back to the question we had earlier, do you find, being open, is there a network for you to join? If there isn't, are you connected to somebody else in the organization that sort of shares sort of your background? And how do you take that to the organization in a structured way? Because what we can't do is ask people to labor on top of their roles. Because what we are doing is we are reproducing, as you say, that system where we're asking people who are already probably the most junior in the organization and the least well paid to do more work. to help us understand. Where actually, if you are in a position, you're, you know, of authority, you are, you are managing others, you are responsible for a program of work, you're responsible for bringing people in the organization, you're, you know, in a D&I role. I would say it is fundamentally incumbent upon us to advocate for those resources for others. And we have to do that with evidence. We have to do that with understanding the lived experience. And we have to do that by really educating ourselves, because there's lots that, in terms of, I talked about the lens that I see the world in, there's a whole other sort of intersecting identities that I don't know about. I have to educate myself. I can't ask somebody else to do that for me. So it means that we all have to do the work. It's a collective approach to ensuring that fundamentally we have equality in our organizations.
There are 2 questions on the chat, and I will allow both of them. So it might overrun slightly, but let's try. Tess, you're next.
Hi, Dr. Balissa, great to finally meet you. I actually work in Army headquarters as a Lieutenant Colonel, as a reserve officer, about to start my Prof Doc in organisational psychology in Birkbeck, and my study is going to be the part-time workforce, i.e. the reserves in the Army. And I'm currently on the Advanced Command Staff course, which, interestingly, yesterday we did the D&I, and it would have been brilliant to have a speaker such as yourself there, rather than reading all the JSPs. My question is about the disconnect, and I want to know, how is the Army ensuring there's not a disconnect between the senior decision makers and the actual soldiers on the ground? You know, there's a danger that sometimes the senior officers are being told what they want to hear than the reality. So how can you influence that from your position to make sure D&I is actually getting right down to the ground, to the soldiers that can understand it in a language that they understand, rather than the language that the senior officers understand?
Absolutely, Tess, that's a fantastic question. And I think I'll straight away sort of come with, you know, so for those of you who don't, so the Chief of General Staff wrote this letter. He wrote a letter saying, this is what I expect. This is how, you know, we expect our organization to run. And there is no place for any kind of discrimination in the organization. So we thought, well, how is that going to be accessible to junior soldiers? So hence we have the Army Teamwork video. So for those of you who want to go and see it, it's on YouTube. I'm going to put a plug for it. Type in Army Teamwork. I think it's got about 24,500 views. That is the video that we then launched with our E&C, our communications team, so it makes it relevant. It makes it relevant to people in terms of those messages. And part of the work of D&I teams is really not to, it is about communication. It's about communicating with the organization rather than communicating to. So I can sort of speak for our team. So we talked about the network support posts, and that was a fundamental recognition that we have thousands of people who join networks, but how does their message, their lived experience get up to policymakers such as ourselves? And then how do we feed that up the chain to our senior officers? So we're very much in the space where we have done that through sort of creating these additional posts and the resources, but also having constant communication through briefings. I mean, yesterday I talked about, probably it was in the call earlier, we had a meeting with, you know, people who just were part of the network, not the network leads, to talk about some of the policy updates that we were sort of implementing. And it has to be a constant flow of information. And then we need to talk about governance as well. And I'll just sort of touch on that, in that we do have a governance structure in place, so that what we're not getting is, yes, it's all good here, nothing to see, it's all wonderful. We actually do have a forum twice a year where we meet with individuals doing D&I throughout the organization. We've created additional posts to work in the field army, to work in sort of other parts of the organization that can't reach up into the policy team, people who are away, who are overseas. You know, how do we support them in terms of doing that work? So we have done that, and by creating these additional roles, and we do have a sort of governance structure in place where we are getting information from the shop floor, as it were, And as you well know, we have the climate assessment process that I kind of touched on earlier. Are you talking to your people? Are you measuring and thinking about what's happening in your organization? How are you using your people surveys and the information that you're collecting to actually make change? So it's a journey for us, and it's just kind of embedding, but certainly it's one we're looking forward to sort of carrying on.
Thank you. Sorry, Tess. Sorry to interrupt. And there was a question from Helen Blake. I don't know if you're still around.
Yes, still here.
Okay, cool. Would you like to ask your question, or would you like me to ask for you?
Well, I think a lot of it's been touched on already, but it was, so I don't know if you want to add anything else, Balissa, but it was just about leaders as role models, and whether there was any examples, in addition to what you've already said, I guess, about how, you know, in terms of the culture and how everybody's looking to leaders and that they're taking the direction of the organisation, and what should we expect to see from them?
Yeah,
that's a good question. Thank you, Helen. So I think I kind of touched on leadership as an example before, but I would just sort of reiterate that going back to sort of bringing your whole self to work, being safe, and that sort of psychological safety, feeling that you can show up to work and give of your best and bring all of who you are. If our leaders aren't creating that environment to do that, then that is a problem, right? And if you are in a leadership position, I think if anyone on this call is in a leadership position, I think that's always something to be mindful of. You have to be mindful of who is looking and what conditions are you creating. And I think it's incumbent on all of us. I think if that's an issue, and if you are seeing that, if you're not a leader yourself and you're seeing that, I think the question mark, you know, what are the spaces that you have to sort of call that out? You know, how can you, if you can't, then, you know, what are the conversations that you can have? You know, a problem shared is a problem halved, I suppose. You know, are you talking to anybody else in the organization about that, or are you carrying that burden on your own? So there is definitely a role for leaders to play, and without leadership that is sincere in this space, then it's going to be very difficult for any sort of progression at all in this space.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, for that question. And I think, are there any last words anybody wants to add, to put on your mic and just throw it out there? I think we could have made this a 2 hour, 3 hour, half a day session, and we still would run out of time, I think.
Absolutely.
Would you like to, Balissa, is there any, I don't know, sorry to sound so banal, but top tips for leaders on this call, or top tips for people wanting to engage but not knowing how to start, first steps?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think so many people want to start, but they stop because they're afraid. And I think my question would be, it's to really ask yourself, what are you afraid of? And am I afraid of giving up my seat? Am I afraid of backlash? You know, what am I afraid of? And I think once you identify that, then you can start to think of what actions can I do? So I think a top tip would be, one, to be curious with yourself. And then also to be curious about what's happening around for everyone else in your organization, because I think we sometimes get very tunnel focused on us and our career and what's happening. But then when you look up, you say, well, who's next to me? Who's at my right? Who's at my left? And what could I have done to help someone along? I would be sharing information, sharing stuff with information that I have. And sort of just letting people around me know that I'm available. I'm available, not me, Balissa, but that you are available to support, that you're there to help. You're there to be curious and you're there to learn. And you're not there to expect someone to teach you sort of for free.
One last question that just occurred to me. In this world of social media and everyone kind of just does a thumbs up. I mean, I've been thumbing up and hearting everything on this chat. How do we, I guess, you know, we signed so many petitions and all that, but somehow maybe there are things that people just need to get off their backside and roll up their sleeves. so to speak. Is there a way to counter it, or do we continue to sign petitions, but hopefully just move a bit more?
No, Pam, I would say, and I think I've given you sort of examples within this chat already about how little things can make such a big difference. And activism is not always about sort of signing. I call it micro activism. Yeah. Things like, you know, if there are any parents on the call, you know, what books and resources are your children coming home with?
Yeah.
You know, what do they look like? Can you write to the school and say, hey, I noticed that we don't have so many diverse books in the library. Is it possible that I can give you a list? Excuse me, who is being asked to do that work, right? So there's lots that we can do and lots of little things. And I think we just have to start.
Yes,
there's never going to be a right time. There's never going to be the right moment. There's never going to be the right anything. I think sometimes you just have to feel the fear and do it anyway. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it is actually true. You just have to say, okay, this is going to be really uncomfortable, but I'm going to have this conversation. And I think as a final word, as it were, is I would really encourage people to start with intention. As Uracha and I talk about this all the time. What is your intention for what you're about to do? I always ask myself, I'm going into a difficult meeting, I'm having a difficult conversation, or anything. What is my intention for this? Because your intention will drive the behavior. It often does. So I think if you're going into things and you haven't thought it through, then that's really difficult. And you'll find yourself in a bit of a muddle. I want to do the right thing. Well, what does that look like? What's the right thing? What does right mean to me? What do I want? Okay. What do I want to get out of this? So I think it's really important to be clear about what your intention is before you start.
Yeah. Great. On that powerful note, I think we'd like to thank Balissa, thank Uracha, and thank all of you on this call. If you want to unmute and clap again, please do. I have
clap for Uracha and for Pam and for Isabel.
I've underlined four things: benefits, structures, resources, and intention from this call. On top of everything else.
I want to add a fifth thing, if that's okay.
Sure.
Real quick, solidarity. My problem is your problem, and your problem is my problem.
Absolutely. I think that's a great note to end us off on, Uracha. Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for having me. It's been a really great conversation, and I hope we've inspired some other people. We've inspired people to sort of go on and have conversations, even if it's about this conversation that they've had today. But use your platform. Use your platform.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Keep safe in the sun. Keep safe on Freedom Day.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your time today, and for your generosity in listening and really wanting to learn. We're so grateful. And maybe, you know, if people actually want to have another conversation like this later on, perhaps the Center for Professional Development can facilitate another one. We would be very happy to continue this work with all of you on board. And yeah, as Pam says, stay safe, everybody, and solidarity to all of you, and lots of love. Thank you so much, and thank you, Balissa and Pam, for today. Thank you, Isabel. Take care.
Thank you.